Welcome, everyone. My name is Jen Bunty. For those of you that don't know me, I'm the Public Info Coordinator for the Consortium of Appalachian Fire Managers and Scientists for one of the Joint Fire Science Program's regional exchanges, Fire Science Exchanges, as part of the Fire Science Exchange Network. I'd like to welcome you all today and thank you for joining us. Our presentation and discussion is going to be on passenger pigeons. If you're not sure why you're here, that's why you're here. This topic is something I can say I have never heard mentioned before in a workshop, in a webinar, in a meeting, in a presentation, in my current position. And after a few calls with Ben, who is our main speaker today, I'm hoping that all of you will have the same reaction that I've had, which is, why have I not heard this topic brought up before? Why haven't we been talking about this giant missing disturbance in our forests in the eastern US? And how can we start incorporating this idea into restoration and management efforts? So for those of you joining us that work in fire, I know we all tend to think of fire on this landscape as this huge missing component in our ecosystems. And sometimes it kind of seems like we're the only ones that see that, but I'll confess that now I'm adding passenger pigeons to that list of these giant missing components in terms of forest health and ecosystem resilience. So a brief overview of today. We'll hear first from Dr. Ian Thompson. He's the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer and Senior Director for the Historic Preservation Program of the Choctaw Nation in Oklahoma. Next, we'll hear from Ben Novak, the lead scientist with Revive and Restore. He'll give us an in-depth look at the environmental and evolutionary history of passenger pigeons. Following Ben's presentation, we'll open it up for Q&A, and I am sure we will have a lively discussion, hoping for one. But please feel free to send your questions through the chat or using the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen. And feel free to throw them up there whenever they come to you, and we'll work through them when we get to that portion. And without further ado, Ian, would you like to introduce yourself and kick off your presentation?
Sure. Halito, Sahoch Chafoya Ian Thompson, Choctaw Mishnaholo Oklahoma Mintali. Independence, Missouri, Amaspoatok, Kia Himak Mitok, Sadiq Chiemi, Ilti Tokloka, Antlers, Oklahoma, Bilinka Ilashwa. Atako, Oklahoma, Choctaw, Okla Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, Toksalali. Imano, Noholo, Imanopa, Tosholachi. Hello, everyone. I reach you in the beautiful Choctaw language. My name's Ian, Choctaw and Euro-American. I was born in Independence, Missouri, but now I live with my wife, Amy, near Antlers, Oklahoma, and I serve as the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer. I've got a slideshow that I'm gonna put up here. So Jen mentioned me as an expert on the passenger pigeon. I hate to disagree, but I am certainly not an expert on the passenger pigeon, but I'll call one out to some different tribal folks who work with the Forest Service and possibly other federal agencies for anyone that had knowledge about the connections between their traditional culture and the passenger pigeon. And I happen to know just a little bit, so I guess that got me at the front of the list. So I'll share what little bit I do know. The Choctaw language is a descriptive language. A lot of times the language includes knowledge within it, traditional knowledge, just by the words themselves. For example, the Choctaw word for the direction east is Hashi Akochaka, and that means where the sun comes out. That's a reference to the sun rising on the east coast from the Atlantic Ocean. The word for west is Hashi Aokatonla, which means where the sun reclines into the water. That's a reference to the Pacific Ocean. The Choctaw name for south is Okmahli, and that means water wind. That refers to in the summertime, the heat and the humidity come off of the Gulf into Choctaw country, which is present-day Mississippi, part of Alabama, in the form of storms. They head north. The Choctaw word for north is Falami, and that refers to return. The reason that the Choctaw word for north is called return is because there was a concept that in the fall, towards the winter time, the same wind that had blown north in the summer began to blow south. And with it, it brought migratory birds. And by far most spectacular of those migratory birds was the passenger pigeon. The Choctaw language, the word for passenger pigeon is Pachi. There are a few other words, Pachanosi, which is pigeon roost, Pachi Oshi, which is a squab or a young passenger pigeon or even an egg. And then knock oshi, which is a type of small shot that was used for hunting pigeons and passenger pigeons in the couple centuries after European arrival. The language records memories on the landscape of the passenger pigeon. Most of these have to do with roosts, and I'll talk about roosts in a little bit. I imagine Ben will quite a bit more after me. There's a place in the Choctaw language called Pachanosi in Mississippi. It's within Choctaw County. Pachanosi means where the pigeons sleep. So this is a reference to a pigeon roost there. Choctaw people, as I'll describe in a little bit, most of us were ultimately moved out of our homeland in Mississippi to Oklahoma on the Trail of Tears. And even in Oklahoma, in our new area, we still had a connection with the pigeon. There's a place just about 20 miles from where I'm broadcasting now called Pigeon Roost, Oklahoma. It was named for a major passenger pigeon roost that was there in the early 1800s. It still lives on today, not just in a place name, but there's a Cumberland Presbyterian Church there, Pigeon Roost. So that's a living language connection between the Choctaw people and the passenger pigeon. Another thing from the Choctaw language is that our traditional calendar is broken up into 13 months based on the phases of the moon. And one of these months corresponding to February is Watonlak Hashi. That means crane month. That is probably a reference not just to cranes, but in general to the migratory birds that were living in Choctaw country during the winter time. The passenger pigeon in particular, my understanding is that it spent the warm season up around the Great Lakes and massive nesting areas. And then in the cool season, it would fly down to more southerly parts. There are descriptions from the Choctaw homeland from the 1700s that talk about flocks of passenger pigeons flying over at 60 miles an hour, and it took them 2 days to fully pass. So we're talking millions upon millions of birds in these migrations. In the wintertime, they would fly around Choctaw country during the day. And, we have accounts from the time period that talk about them being particularly fond of beech nuts, but we know that they spent time in river canebrakes and a number of the other ecosystems that our ancestors lived in and managed with the use of fire. As you know from the Choctaw place names, passenger pigeons were a focus for Choctaw people and culture where they roosted. At these roosts, they'd come together in the evening. Again, from descriptions from our homeland, maybe 4 o'clock in the evening or so, they'd start to congregate. And they would sit on these trees where they had some protection from ground predators at night. But oftentimes it would be just thousands upon thousands of these birds in a single tree. The accounts from our homeland talk about the noise of their chirping being deafening. They talk about there being so many birds in some of the trees that they'd break big branches out of them and fall off. This animal and this migration was obviously a resource for Choctaw people, as reflected in the month name and the place names on the landscape. I've seen stories recorded by Choctaw elders about how these animals were hunted. One of the techniques was pretty blunt but effective. They'd go out after dark when the birds were roosted, and they'd go up under one of the roosting trees with a torch. And one hunter would hold the torch, and another hunter would just take a club and a bag and club sleeping birds, and they'd fall into the bag. And that was about it. I've heard other accounts that they may have used a blowgun in that hunting technique, but it wasn't really necessary. One of the dishes that was made from passenger pigeon is called Ashila in the Choctaw language. The recipe that I have, which is from when passenger pigeons were still around, is that they'd take a bird and they would clean it and they would hang it up over the coals of a fire and they'd roast it until the outside got nice and seared, dark colored. And then they'd take a clay pot, set it on the fire, fill it with water, and they'd put the bird in there. They'd put the roasted bird in there. They'd let it boil until the meat fell off the bones. They'd pick out the bones, and then they'd slowly start to stir in small amounts of cornmeal to thicken it, and a little more until they had a nice, thick, rich broth. This was a pretty common food in Choctaw country in the wintertime when these birds were available. It's still made today. There's still Choctaw families today that make Ashila, of course, domesticated chicken substituted for passenger pigeon or wild bird. My wife and I actually make it at our house all the time. We cook it for the community all the time. Usually we use turkey. It's a great way to cook up leftover Thanksgiving turkey. As you see in the picture there, sometimes we add beans and sunflower seeds to it. It just makes it a little bit more filling, but it's a dish that connects our community back with the passenger pigeon. We know from archaeology that passenger pigeons have been eaten by native people in and around the Choctaw homeland since the end of the Pleistocene, a little more than 10,000 years ago. The Stanfield-Worley Bluff site in northwestern Alabama has remains of passenger pigeon where people ate them. Moundville Archaeological Site, a place that's affiliated with the Choctaw and other Muskogean-speaking tribes, that's located near the present town of Tuscaloosa, Alabama. There are a number of passenger pigeon remains that were recovered there archaeologically, and also with the Lubbock Creek site, which is located just about 25 miles from Moundville. Passenger pigeon remains there too. It's interesting the context that these remains are found in. I mean, obviously they were used for food, but it's fairly common for them to be associated with special places like the earth mounds at these settlements, with houses and trash features that are interpreted as being from the community's leaders' residences. So this bird seems to have been associated particularly as a food for community leaders. Also, some of the contexts associate passenger pigeon with other colorful birds from the American Southeast. Things like the Carolina parakeet and the green heron. Sometimes their bones are found with the passenger pigeon bones at these ancestral sites. You know, that suggests there may have been a color symbolism, and there may have been quite a bit more going on with the use of the passenger pigeon than just the food itself. For Choctaw people, we've been within our homeland. Our oral histories go back a very long way. They talk about Pleistocene megafauna and the impact that megafauna had on particular landscapes, most especially the Black Belt Prairie. For 600 generations, at least a core group of our ancestors had lived in this area, and they'd managed the land. Obviously, the regular use of range fires was one part of the management, but it went a lot deeper than that in ways that really would be beyond the presentation to explain today. But it created habitats that were useful for the passenger pigeon and a variety of other plants and animals. In the early 1800s, the Choctaw Nation, piece by piece, ceded over its land to the United States. Some of that was definitely under coercion. This set up the Trail of Tears for most Choctaw people. Beginning in 1830, groups of Choctaws made the overland trip to what's now southeastern Oklahoma. Eventually, most of the tribe was removed. The part that did remain in Mississippi had their land sold right out from under their feet, and they had to move to places that were not the most hospitable. When this happened, an ecological disaster occurred. So this is a picture of Olsey. He's a Choctaw man sitting in a longleaf pine forest within the Choctaw homeland in the late 1800s. Those trees go up 100 feet to the first branch, but you can see back behind them the sunlight's hitting the soil. So this was an old growth forest that allowed sunlight to hit the soil. The understory was basically a tall grass prairie. It had some of the highest ecological diversity outside of the tropics. But when this land was ceded over, it was managed in a very different way. I know that we have a number of people from the Forest Service on the presentation today, and you guys are all aware that from about the 1880s to the 1930s, the area was logged over. This is how it ended up looking. The longleaf pine forest across the southeast, according to my understanding, was reduced from about 37 million acres to 1 million acres. And when this happened, it caused massive soil erosion. That's evident in pollen samples from the bogs and the wetlands of the Choctaw homeland right around the mid-1800s. Longleaf pine was not the only casualty. Native upland vegetation communities were reduced by 97%. Canebrakes, which passenger pigeon relied on, were reduced by 98%. And the native tallgrass prairie was reduced by 99%. When Choctaw people moved to Oklahoma, basically the same thing happened. After allotment in the early 1900s, a lot of families leased out their land to sharecroppers, and the same practices that precipitated the Dust Bowl 10 years later occurred here, massive soil erosion. This is what some of these areas look like today. They've grown back with vegetation that may or may not be native. They're not managed by fire. They really aren't very good places for habitat diversity or for supporting human life. In essence, they're different places than they were 200 years ago. The passenger pigeon was one of a number of species that got caught up in this. The latest accounts from the Choctaw homeland that I'm aware of that talk about the passenger pigeon from the 1880s. Its demise was a result of massive habitat loss, such as you've seen in these pictures within Choctaw country in the American South, its wintering areas, combined with extreme overhunting in its summer nesting areas up by the Great Lakes. According to the studies I've done, the passenger pigeon was just one of about 100 species that have gone extinct in the Choctaw homeland in the last 200 years. But obviously it was a major one, one of the natural wonders of the area. This is just a picture I came across of hunting the passenger pigeon in Louisiana in the late 1800s. This type of hunting was not the most damaging. Again, it was hunting at the nesting sites that was the most damaging. But there's always hope. So this is a picture of a spot at DeSoto National Forest. DeSoto National Forest, like others across the United States, is in many ways working to bring back diverse native habitat. And the ways that they're doing that mimic the same land management practices that Indigenous communities practiced across this land for thousands of years. Each year, we take our youth to this spot on what we call Indigenous Immersion Camp. They're folks who are identified as future cultural leaders, and we get them used to the land and traditional cultural roles on the land here in Oklahoma. Then we take them to Mississippi, our homeland, but not just to see the land itself, but to go specifically to places that are managed like they were in the past. So this is one of those spots for you land managers that may think that, you know, there's not a huge segment of the American population that appreciates all your hard work. I'd like to say that we certainly do. We appreciate what you do. And maybe, just maybe, we'll see passenger pigeon here again. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Ben.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Thompson. That was really great and incredible. So, hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. I'm really excited to get to give this talk today on a lot of the research that we've been doing with multiple collaborators through Revive and Restore for the past 9 years now on passenger pigeons. You know, our project started with an idea, a spark by Stuart Brand of, you know, perhaps modern biotechnologies could bring the passenger pigeon back to life. And the science has, you know, shaped around that concept. And there were some open questions when we started this work about the natural history and the ecological place of the passenger pigeon. And, you know, would this be a species that would survive in the world today and benefit conservation today? And, you know, without spoiling the talk, I'm happy to say that we're still working towards it because we definitely feel that's where the data has taken us. The outline of my talk today, I'm going to start with the evolutionary history of the pigeon and what our science says on that now, and then it's science, and then it's extinction and ecology, all through the lens of the new research we've been doing. And then talk about the relationship of passenger pigeons to forests. Then we'll get into the neat parts of de-extinction that a lot of people find fascinating, but I actually love all of the rest of the ecology a lot, and the most part really. And then 5, what this could mean for forest management to have the birds back or until we get them back. So with that, I will start with the natural history. So thanks to the genetic sequencing we've been doing, we know that about 15 million years ago, some, you know, ancestor of today's North American pigeons, which I've made up this name, a Columba patagynus progenitor, arrived from Eurasia and spread through North America like so many other species, like the Proboscideans and others. And when it hit, you know, the Rocky Mountains, really, it split down the coasts. One group going to the west, which evolved into the band-tailed pigeon, and another group splitting and going to the east, to the very rich forests about 12 million years ago. And we're going to revisit that eastern lineage, but talk about the rest for a second, because all these species from the band-tailed pigeon forward are cousins of the passenger pigeon, and they had a really dynamic 12 million years. They continued on down to South America, evolving into a host of different species, inhabiting many different environments. And there's actually so many, I had to do this animation in 2 parts. they ended up coming back up into the north to the Caribbean islands. In total, 17 species of the Patagynus genus evolved over the last 12 million years. But something very different was happening in the eastern United States. The population of pigeons that got there arrived and were met with huge, vast forests that had been stable for millions and millions of years. And this huge resource allowed their populations to become very large, very unlike the more mountainous montane forests of the West. And there was a key thing that happened. These birds went from being territorial nesters of low densities to being colonial nesters. And this spark is what made the passenger pigeon what it became. Of the world's 350 pigeon species, it's the only one that is a true colonial nester, the way marine birds nest on islands. These birds were very comfortable nesting together on the same branches. There are records of over 100 nests in a single tree, possibly more. And in those high social densities, they needed to be able to compete for mates. This is one of the few pigeon species in the world that the male has a different coloration than the female. They have they're the only North American pigeon in that lineage to have a graduated tail, all features for sexual signaling to try and get the best mating possible in a group of millions and millions and billions. And it was billions. That blue there is where they lived, where they were nomadic. They developed an extremely unique way of life, which I'll explain as we keep going through. And after 15 million years of evolving, they were driven to extinction in a matter of decades. In the mid 1800s, there was at least still 3 billion of these birds flocking in flocks of several hundred million to the largest flock ever recorded could have been 3.7 billion birds. The accounts from so many different people talk about them completely darkening the sun, being deafening. This was probably one of the grandest natural phenomenon in the world's history. Intensive commercial harvesting, deforestation, a number of things of human changes to the landscape ended up contributing to the extinction, but by no means none of it was as severe as the commercial harvesting. Literal tons, megatons of passenger pigeons were shipped by trains to cities. It was one of the first species ever hunted using modern telecommunication technology so they could head off the birds where they were at. This was an incredibly lucrative business. By 1902, the last bird was shot in the wild. And by 1914, the last one in captivity died. The last few in captivity were probably highly inbred, and they were never good breeders. There's a very interesting history there. But in this talk, I want to talk about these birds in the wild. And to really learn about these birds, I highly recommend reading a book chapter from Immersion by Chief Pokegan of the Potawatomi people. And I'm sorry if I'm saying those names incorrectly, but he was one of the most eloquent speakers of this species. And I put up this really long quote here because I think it's really lovely. As he says, "It was proverbial with our fathers that if the Great Spirit had ever could have created a more elegant bird in plumage or form, he never did." He talks about how early in his life these birds spanned everywhere, and he never thought that they would go extinct because even though he had witnessed the deer and the elk and the buffalo go extinct, these were local, and the pigeons were everywhere. Yet within his lifetime, the pigeons disappeared, went from billions to zero. And white people tried to tell him that, oh, they've just moved west. There were stories that they went to the Gulf of Mexico or South America, that they're out there somewhere. We didn't kill them all. But of course, Chief Pokegan had direct ties to other First Nations peoples in the West who told him they weren't there. Today, all we have of passenger pigeons are these specimens in museum drawers and stuffed cases. But because they were so numerous, we actually have more material from passenger pigeons than almost any other recently extinct animal. And those are the materials where we've been able to sequence their genome and get DNA. People have done isotopic work. The last few years since we started this de-extinction work has actually seen somewhat of a renaissance of research in passenger pigeons, more research than there has been in decades. And now I'll share with you something that none of those papers or books previously has ever put together, and that's the actual census population size of the passenger pigeon as it declined. This has been really difficult to put together. I used sources from Shorger, that's the major work on passenger pigeons, Joel Greenberg's updated work from 2014, works from Ontario that Shorger cites. But the key thing I've done to calculate the population size of passenger pigeons is to relate it to the forests. So I found this 1870 map of forest densities. And while this isn't going to be perfect for using for the whole 1800s, it was a nice anchor point. And I took records of nesting sites and took the lower bound and upper bound of forestry density and the lower bound and upper bound of potential nest density and made a calculation of passenger pigeon census size. And at a certain point in this curve in the 1800s, they go from uncountable, where you have to do all of this fancy calculation to estimate, to directly observable and countable. So this curve is made of different methods put together, and this is what it looks like. This species declined very drastically, but you'll notice it's a log scale. That's the only way to even make this apparent. Forgive that extra bit of text there. In 1871 was the largest nesting event recorded. By 1882 was the last large nesting event ever recorded. In 1885, the last large flocks were observed, and that's the point when they finally become countable. A lot of people think passenger pigeons were protected, and that's not really the case. The only law protecting passenger pigeons was passed in Michigan in 1898. Subsequently, persecution of passenger pigeons never stopped, and after that law was passed, the last bird shot in Michigan just so happened to be the only bird known to have been illegally poached. And by 1900, the last juvenile was shot, which actually tells us that the birds were still breeding. There was at least one breeding pair still producing one baby in the year 1900. And by 1902, the last bird, an adult male, was shot in Indiana. And I want to focus in on that the last birds ever observed were not observed, they were shot. Persecution of this species never stopped. It only intensified. And when they became too rare to be commercially harvestable, people wanted just to go and find them even more. But the last birds shot, some of them were shot by mistake. Buttons in Columbus was actually shot out of a flock of mourning doves because this bird's need to be social was so strong that the world's last passenger pigeon wasn't exactly a lonely bird. It was flocking with whatever other bird it could find. There was a record of a passenger pigeon flocking with domestic pigeons in the Chicago area, flocking with mourning doves. But I think the most interesting point on this timeline I want to share is that while some people have said that no one could have seen the extinction coming, somebody did. In 1947, Benedict Henry Revoix predicted the extinction to the date of the passenger pigeon because he came to America and witnessed how people were harvesting these pigeons. And at a time when there was probably still 5 billion passenger pigeons, he said, by the end of the century, these will be gone. And he was right. So there's been new research. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. This is what that curve looks like. So there was a 54% decline for over 18 years from 1860 to 1878. In the next 7 years, the population dropped 98.4%. The next 6 years, another 99.9%. The next 6 years, another 98%. And of course, completely collapsed in the final 5 years. Those are the rates of decline per year for those periods. So really, it's about a 6 to 7 year period. It's less than 2 decades that we see the complete collapse of this species. There are a lot of common assumptions about passenger pigeons, which I'm going to address in this work. today. So one is that passenger pigeons were a density-dependent species. This was popularized by Halliday in the 80s. And this would mean that they were vulnerable to extinction when they hit a certain population size. There's another common assumption that passenger pigeons were dependent upon particular habitat types to breed, that deforestation was a primary cause of the passenger pigeon extinction, not human harvesting, and that giant flocks of passenger pigeons were an unnatural recent phenomenon caused by the release of human food resource competition. Um, so the new science is in not just from our team, but on all of these topics. And so the first one, were they density dependent? Well, with this population curve, recent research analyzed reproductive records and found that there was no evidence of functional extinction of the passenger pigeon, meaning that they were breeding effectively right up until the end. However, this study only analyzed basically the last tail end of this population curve, and because no one had this population curve before, it wasn't really possible to know that they were only, they knew they were sampling them when they were rare, but without knowing what the reproduction was like when there were giant flocks, the reproductive capacity might have been much, much, much lower than it should have been to recover. I got in touch with the authors of this paper, and while it's not published yet, was able to get them a lot more records going all the way back to 1810. So we've expanded that same analysis, including this entire curve, and got the same result. There was no evidence of functional extinction or loss of reproductive capacity for passenger pigeons when there was 100 of them left versus when there were 3 billion of them. So ultimately, there was no evidence for any alley effect ever happening. This seems to be pretty clear from genetics research as well. Were passenger pigeons dependent on particular habitat for breeding? This goes back to Shorger in 1955. And for this next sequence of data, I have to thank Sam Mady. He has compiled a whole bunch of data that I started putting together when I was 20 years old, and he has just really filled this in the last few months. So these maps are all from him. These are nesting and roosting sites of passenger pigeons from Shorger's book and several other sources. And you do see a certain pattern here, which Shorger outlined in his book, the gray line being the full range of the nomadic passenger pigeon, and the dark black he called the principal breeding range. And in 1955, when he drew that line, he set up an assumption that everyone else just ran with. No one ever tested it. So there's been a lot of assumptions that the habitat types of that region are what the passenger pigeon relied upon. So we started filling in more of this map with more records, migration observations where passenger pigeons were, specimens that were collected, where did they come from? And then here I'm just going to go that these were all from previously published records. And in the last few months, Sam was able to go through unpublished Shorter records and fill in more of this map. And this is the map we see. And while the principal breeding range does look like there are tons and tons more observations there are some biases worth pointing out. Shorger was based in Wisconsin, and in the 20s and 30s and 40s when he was doing this work, there was no internet or phones that you could just easily call anybody anywhere. So he relied heavily on what he could get his hands on, and he traveled to local libraries. So consequently, the majority of records he collected are from Wisconsin and the Great Lakes areas. You'll notice that there's not very many records from the South, except for this very weird panhandle of Texas record. All of those records in the panhandle of in the upper north top of Texas there. I mean, that's actually just basically one record. Every county recorded birds in the same season. It's pretty rare to get that kind of coverage. We knew the birds were in the South. There's breeding records in the South, so were they just more absent there? What's going on? Are there more biases? It turns out that really, if you just do more library research, you fill in the map. Another researcher recently did work on Texas and found in the 1870s and early 80s, she found nesting and roosting records for almost every county of eastern Texas. So if people really dug into their local libraries in the South, I'm sure the South would begin to fill up just as much as the North, and more breeding sites would be known. And that by itself starts to disintegrate this idea of a principal breeding area. But the habitats within those breeding areas is what really kind of dispels this idea of dependency on habitat. These are all of the nesting sites from the data, and we couldn't get the actual layer of the habitat type, so this was done in Photoshop rather than beautifully done in ArcGIS. Just want to give that caveat. But as you can see, passenger pigeons nested in large and small groups in literally dozens of different vegetation types, really not discriminatorily. As long as there was enough food to feed a flock of their size and the weather conditions were good, they were going to settle down and do that. As far down as the southern Mississippi, to as high north as the Hudson Bay. There's probably a lot more places they nested. We just don't have records from those, because the most telltale sign that this is hugely observation bias is just looking at human census data from that time. This is from 1870, and that principal breeding range is basically the principal range of where human beings were settled and where most of the activity harvesting those birds was taking place because of the railroads between Chicago and New York. So in truth, we really should be considering that the entire range, the entire nomadic range of the passenger pigeon was suitable habitat. They were not dependent on a particular habitat in any way. And this goes back to more than 100,000 years in bone assemblages. The oldest known fossil I could find of a passenger pigeon is 250,000 years old. And throughout the eastern US, archaeological, zooarchaeological, and paleontological sites have passenger pigeons in the Holocene and the late Pleistocene. So which played a larger role in their extinction, the unregulated harvesting at commercial industrial scale or deforestation? And so while deforestation undoubtedly played a significant role, it probably wasn't the major role, partly because deforestation, while it was significant, lagged behind the population decline of passenger pigeons slightly. And model work by Jessica Stanton in 2014 actually found in simulations that human hunting alone could account for the passenger pigeon's extinction. When she modeled it without deforestation, she still ended up getting passenger pigeon extinction. But when she modeled passenger pigeon dynamics without the hunting, only with deforestation, they still survived. Their population went down, but it would have still survived, even with major areas of forest being cleared, partly because of how plastic they were, because they could eat so many different types of food, and take advantage of so many different types of forests. So on to the next one. Were passenger pigeon megaflocks a recent phenomenon driven by human interactions? This was popularized by Charles Mann, who ran with a hypothesis from Newman in the 80s. And this is probably the most pervasive and problematic idea out there on passenger pigeon ecology, because as Dr. Thompson already talked about, the First Nations people have a history with these birds that goes back so far that it's hard to think that something Europeans could come up with in the last 500 years was a big dent on their history. But we modeled it anyway. We did, so using genetics, using mitochondrial genomes from 42 passenger pigeons from the late 1800s and several dating back to 4,000 years ago and the 1600s as well, we were able to test these hypotheses using coalescent models. So the Newman hypothesis is that Europeans arrived, and because of the decimation and genocide of the First Nations peoples pushing them out, there was no longer human competition for food and resources, which released the passenger pigeon from that competition. This is absurd for many, many, many reasons, but I won't go into that. Heming Chung in 2014 put forth a hypothesis that they were dependent upon oak trees, meaning that their trajectory would have followed oak. There's the idea that we came up with that perhaps they were actually more dependent on deciduous forests in truth. So not just oak, but the entire deciduous community, which overtook coniferous communities about 5,000 years ago. And of course, there's the idea that it was more related to glacial cover. A lot of species, when we do these curves, end up being at low numbers during the last glacial maximum and then recover as the world warms. This is the actual curve we got from passenger pigeon data. As you can see, these birds became abundant nearly 50,000 years ago and stayed extremely abundant for a very long time. And this is a sensitive test. I want to stress that. When this same test is used with bison, this is the curve it gets. It shows a decline during the last ice age, another sharp decline as human beings became completely widespread throughout the Americas, even though humans were likely in the Americas for 10 to 15,000 years prior. They became completely widespread and started really becoming a force to reckon with, and reached, apparently around 10,000 years ago, reached a harmony with the way that they were living with bison, and bison numbers began to come back. And then in just the last couple hundred years, the United States, as it was pushing west, exterminated the buffalo, the bison, to actually aid in their war against the First Nations and taking their land. And of course, they exterminated the pigeons. But you'll notice that while the decline of the bison can be detected in their genetics, there is no detectable decline in the passenger pigeon. Their extinction happened so quickly, it wasn't long enough to actually shape their population. And that's a very telling thing. So what was happening in the environment while these flocks of billions were roaming around for thousands of years? Well, I mapped their home range with pollen data assemblages over the last 20,000 years. And that's what this looks like. So the gray in the upper corner is glaciation. And as the glaciers start to melt, you have the cool mixed forest becoming a dominant type. But it's worth noting that these different forest biomes from the south to the north underwent completely different dominant types of trees between coniferous and deciduous, going back and forth. Deciduous trees were actually rare prior to about 7,000 years. Oak trees were rare prior to 12,000 years. And there are many times in which conifer trees and other types of trees were completely dominant. And yet through this entire time, through all of these changes in habitat, in climate, in range density, and range area, the passenger pigeon populations were unaffected. They didn't respond. There's no response up and down like we see with so many other species. This tells us that the passenger pigeon's way of life, their super social flocks, their large numbers, their extremely broad diet, was something that allowed them to be almost impervious to environmental change. As the environment changed, they could just take advantage of whatever came their way. That's really incredible for a species. And so what were they actually doing in the forests? These giant flocks of birds would come in, and as Dr. Thompson had already said, they would overcrowd branches, breaking off branches, and deposit tons of guano onto the forest floor. This was just so dense, it's hard to even imagine. But Audubon did write about it, which I'll get to. And the idea that we have, of course, is that these disturbances fostered regeneration, like from fires and storms. There are anecdotes from Shorger that the year after a pigeon rooster nesting, it was the greenest patch of forest, and that farmers preferred to till old roosts because it was the most fertile land. But it's all anecdotal. There was no real science going on at the time. However, this great passage by Audubon, talks about in the 1830s, he went and visited a roost that was 40 miles by 3 miles wide, so 120 square mile roost. The dung lay several inches deep, covering the whole of the roost. So 120 square miles of several inches of guano, up to several feet in diameter at the trees. And he talks about trees 2 feet in diameter being broken off from the ground, entire trees having collapsed, as if the forest had been hit by a tornado. The noise they made was deafening, and they arrived by the thousands, blotting out the sun. And he was with these farmers out hunting them, and he says there was no point even shouting because he couldn't even hear the gunshots over the noise of the flapping and the cooing, and that their wings, the flock alone changed the air current as they came in through the trees, flying at 60 miles an hour through this forest. Just absolutely incredible accounts. And this isn't just Audubon. These accounts happen again and again and again, from amateurs to professionals, trappers to travelers. So these aren't folklore the way some people exaggerated and made tall tales about nature. There's definitely no way to exaggerate passenger pigeons. He said they were like a tornado. Well, this is what a tornado looks like in forests. In 2011 in Massachusetts, a major string of tornadoes came through. And from space, that's what the tornado track looked like. That's only maybe 20 miles long. So that's a fraction of the size of what a pigeon roost might have looked like, or a pigeon colony. That's what it looks like on the ground and from an airplane. So this is getting close to the idea of the level of disturbance that a passenger pigeon colony might have caused. Wind damage in the south. These images are provided by Adam and Jen. So thank you guys very much. You can see whole trees falling in from wind, with some gaps opening up in the canopy. You know, these are the types of scenes that, if you imagine guano now all over the ground, might get us close to envisioning what a passenger pigeon event in the forest was like. The average size of a roosting and nesting colony for passenger pigeons was about 20 square miles, or 19,200 acres. That's nearly the size of the city of Asheville, North Carolina. That square there is what a pigeon colony would have looked like on top of that. The largest nesting event in history was 850 square miles, or 544,000 acres. That is larger than the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. These major events made this species into an ecosystem engineer. This is the life cycle of the pigeon in the forest. They would come into an area, create a major disturbance, starting the forest cycle. And because they were not migratory, they were nomadic. They were going somewhere new, following the food, following the good weather. Every few weeks, they were doing this on large scales, somewhere new all the time. So basically, when these, for tens of thousands of years, possibly up to 1 million years, I'm happy to talk more about the calculations, this species was maintaining a mosaic of regenerating habitats throughout the eastern forests. Constant flux. And what we know from the records is they would come in, exhaust the resources, and leave. And there might be places where they didn't visit for 2 to 3 years. There's an account from Pokegan that there was a place that they hadn't been in 15 years before they arrived. This was not a yearly event throughout most of the range, because of course the forest had to regenerate to be able to produce a large mast crop or a large berry crop or seed crop of some type to bring these birds back into the area. And so these birds were shaping the environment. And from research on other colonial nesters coming from Australia, we can actually get a good idea of what this might have done when the birds were actually there, creating an ecological hotspot. You can imagine all of that guano as a resource would have attracted tons of invertebrates to feed on it, which would bring their predators. Lots of pigeons would have died at these events from overcrowding, bringing on carrion consumers and their predators, and of course predators and scavengers wanting to eat everything in this food chain. There's likely entire behaviors of species from the eastern US that are gone now because tons of species probably just followed these flocks around at higher densities than their usual background density. And of course, when they left, you would have several years of successional habitats, pollinators coming in, understory vegetation and animals coming in. And so that was a huge force of nature. There's clearly had to have been ripple effects since they're gone. And of course, forestry managers will know that successional habitats today are quite rare, and this is usually attributed to fire suppression, but definitely has something to do with passenger pigeons. In places where fires were less frequent and less intense, passenger pigeons were coming in and stimulating these disturbances on a routine basis. Without the pigeons, we have a major lack of successional habitat types, and the majority of plants and animals that depend on those successional habitats, despite the fact that we have more forests today than we've had in over a century, are in decline. Some of the most significant correlations in this history are with the American burying beetle, which lived almost the exact same range as the passenger pigeon and has almost completely gone extinct today. It turns out that passenger pigeons were the right prey size, that they preferred, right in the sweet spot of size that they would like to bury for their life, that these beetles take a carcass and bury it to lay their eggs, and passenger pigeon carcasses were just the right size that they preferred to select. And so, of course, when there were billions of pigeons, there would have been millions and millions of carcasses at this species disposable every year to complete its life cycle, and that is a resource that is now gone. I actually think that peregrine falcons had an extremely close tie to the passenger pigeon. Peregrine falcons around the world happen to be pigeon specialists, despite the fact that they will eat more than 400 types of prey. Research from other places in the world show that peregrine falcons will 9 times out of 10 go for a pigeon or a dove over anything else if they have it available, even though they're harder to catch. These two groups of species have been co-evolving in an arms race for a very long time. And peregrine falcons used to be, breed and live year-round in throughout the eastern U.S. After the extinction of the passenger pigeon, they still were hanging around, but the impacts of DDT in the mid-1900s caused a huge decline in most bird species, and by the 1970s, they only lived out west. They went completely extinct in the east, and through conservation efforts, they have been restored. This is where peregrine falcons live today, but there's a key pattern here that's worth noting. I think the restoration of the peregrine falcon actually tells us something extremely important about its past. In the West, where it has survived and recovered, is almost a mirror image, complete overlay of the band-tailed pigeon. In the East, it has become primarily an urban bird, preying on rock pigeons. While there are peregrine falcons in the wilderness, they are definitely at higher densities in urban areas, and that just so happens to be the region that is missing the passenger pigeon. So its preferred prey is gone, and that has created a struggle even for their recovery, even though they're a delisted species. So these impacts after the extinction, this force of nature that it was, of course, leads us to believe that we should bring this species back. That's what Revive and Restore is trying to do. So you might be thinking, what is that? What is de-extinction? What is this all about? How does it work? Well, of course, there are reintroductions, like the wolves returning to Yellowstone that had been gone for 70 years, or the elk in Smoky Mountains National Park that had been gone for 200 years when they were reintroduced. As long as a species still lives somewhere else, you can grab it from somewhere else and bring it in to live in a place where it's been locally exterminated. But in some cases, species go completely extinct everywhere. And so there's something called ecological replacement. The most famous case of this is on the island of Mauritius, where they had their own species of giant tortoise that had evolved in isolation for millions of years, went extinct because of human persecution. And they've brought Aldabran tortoises to the island to fill the ecological role. And their impact on restoring Round Island off the coast of Mauritius has been hugely impactful. But what about species where there's no living substitute that can work, like the woolly mammoth? An Asian elephant cannot possibly be expected to take root in Siberia and survive there through a harsh winter, even with a warming climate. So if you wanted mammoths back, how would you do it? If you want passenger pigeons back, who are completely unique with no living entity to take their place, how would you do it? That's where new biotechnology and de-extinction comes in. De-extinction is basically ecological replacement in which the species being put back into the environment has been intentionally adapted to fill the role of an extinct species through selective breeding or genome editing. And of course, the goal, just like all other forms of restorative conservation, is for ecological processes, biodiversity, bioabundance, to help that habitat. How is it done? Well, there's the quagga project in South Africa, where they've taken living zebras that look like quaggas and started backbreeding them. That's a cool project worth checking out. Worth noting that most extinct species do not have living relatives with close phenotypes. That there's definitely no way you could take band-tailed pigeons or any other species of pigeon and breed them over time to be like passenger pigeons. You would need the selective forces of their environment to do that. Artificial selection just won't do it. Backbreeding is one potential technique if you have descendants, which once again, for most extinct species, we don't. There are multiple projects trying to recreate the aurochs by using all of its descendants, living cattle, to reconstitute the phenotype of the original wild beast. It was actually a significant forest species. For the other 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, hundreds of thousands of extinct species from the last few millennia, gene editing, taking a living relative that is suitable and altering its DNA to take on the phenotypes and ecology of the extinct species, is the only viable path forward. So that is what we are doing for passenger pigeons. And for anyone that's interested in more information on this subject of de-extinction, go check out the paper I wrote in 2018. It's 3 years old, but it's not really dated yet. It's a long read, but it covers most questions you can have, and is open access, so it's free for everybody. Just look up Ben Novak De-extinction in the journal Genes. So I'm actually going to take us off on a tangent for a moment, because I think the Red Canary story is a good way of thinking about what de-extinction is. The Red Canary is the world's first genetically engineered organism. There's a whole book on this. It's very, very, very good read. The Red Canary, the reason it's the world's first genetically engineered organism is because it was created with design and intent to bring genes from one species into another to create a specific type of outcome. And while domestication could be considered maybe a form of engineering, it was happenstance. A phenotype would occur and you would go with it. Well, this was premeditated design. So in this cartoon here, the little yellow and red bars represent the chromosomes of these species. So when you breed and hybridize them, your first generation hybrid gets one set of DNA from its mom, one set from its dad, and it's a first generation hybrid. When you backbreed this to a canary to create something that's more canary and less red siskin, trying to keep just those genes for red, you end up getting recombination on the chromosome. So one of those chromosomes starts to end up getting shuffled about and mixed up with both red and yellow canary combined. And through a series of backbreeding and crossbreeding hybrids, the goal is to get to a bird that eventually is 99.9% yellow canary and just retains the genes that create red color from the red siskin. And people really did do this, and they succeeded. There's a lot more to the story that's actually really cool, but they created the red factor canary, which decades later, the genome of that bird was actually responsible for helping discover what genes create red pigment in some birds. And that's what that genome looks like. It's mostly one species with just a little bit of the genes, key genes and traits from another. That's basically what we want to do with the passenger pigeon, except that we can't breed extinct passenger pigeons. So with gene editing, we can select and bring in key alleles from their genome and overwrite the band-tailed pigeon's genome, creating a hybrid that is mostly band-tailed pigeon. But if we do the job right, will look and behave and be a passenger pigeon. It's worth noting also that the passenger pigeon and the band-tailed pigeon are already 97% identical anyway. So band-tailed pigeons are nearly passenger pigeons. They just need that little extra nudge to get there. And these are not unheard of in nature either. Hybridization is actually quite rampant in nature. Red wolves have ancestry from both gray wolves and coyotes that have trickled into their genome over time. Grizzly bears in North America all have ancestry from polar bears that goes back 30,000 years, but it's only one direction. These species have been hybridizing, but apparently polar bears have no grizzly bear DNA. So this is a really cool story from work from Beth Shapiro's lab, where we did the passenger pigeon genomic work. I highly recommend looking into that story. It's pretty cool science. And of course, for anyone listening today that happens to be a descendant from people that left Africa 100,000 years ago, your ancestors all came into contact with Neanderthals, and all of you, like me today, are hybrids as well. So even the human genome resembles something a little bit like what a de-extinct animal will look like. So that's what de-extinction is, and an analog for how to think of what the species we make will be, but how are we actually going to do it? So there are about 5 stages to this process. The first, sequencing the genome, figuring out the genes we need to care about, then editing them into cells, the second step, putting them into surrogate parents to produce offspring, and then the captive breeding and release to the wild. Now, those first 3 steps are the new part. Those are the biotech parts. Captive breeding and release to the wild restoration efforts have been going on for over a century in conservation, having saved species like the condor and the black-footed ferret and the Przewalski's horse. Conservation is really good at that. That's not the part I'm so concerned with, especially since we've got plenty of forest that a generalist can use. I've actually heard that from other forestry scientists that it's going to be fine on that end, as long as we do the job with the same level of care and thought, using all our science the way other conservationists do. But it's those beginning phases that are new, where we need to innovate and overcome some struggles. We've already sequenced the genome of the passenger pigeon. That data is public for people who want to check it out and maybe get involved with our project, get in hold of me. There's lots of ways any volunteer can help, especially if they do bioinformatics. Genome editing technology exists, of course. It's being used and getting better all the time. And there is a pathway to create the birds. We can't use cloning technologies, but I'll explain the technology we can use and why it's a major hurdle at the moment. Ideally, if we had the money to just kickstart this project right now, rather than working a great deal with collaborations, we could just really do this full force. And I believe we could definitely produce a new generation of passenger pigeons, maybe not even iteratively. We could possibly succeed in a single generation within the next decade or less, if we had significant funding. First, what we need to do is take the living bandtail pigeon and harvest something called their primordial germ cells. These are the cells in a male and a female that become sperm and eggs. So since you can't clone birds, and there's a lot of reasons why you can't do in vitro fertilization effectively, we do this step where we actually go to the cells at a very early stage in development. And if you can culture those cells, you'll be able to do the gene editing steps necessary to recreate the passenger pigeon genome. And you can take those edited cells and implant them into a growing embryo, and they will colonize the testes and ovaries, just like the other germ cells. And you'll end up, after incubating and hatching that bird and raising that bird to adulthood, you'll end up with perhaps a rock pigeon or a bandtail pigeon, depending on what we use, that looks completely normal. Yet on the inside, in its testes and ovaries, it produces the sperm and egg cells that we've gene edited. So if you take a mother and a father of those chimeras and breed them, theoretically we'll hatch a new generation of passenger pigeons. The key technology we need to do this is the ability to culture those primordial germ cells. This is possible with domestic chickens. It's how domestic chickens are edited and engineered all the time nowadays, since that was invented in 2006. But this ability has not yet been transferred to any other species of bird. Revive and Restore is now working with a couple labs in the United States to get this work off the ground and diversify to other species, because this isn't just a barrier to passenger pigeon de-extinction. This is a barrier to applying gene editing and even genetic preservation to endangered birds today. Now, the goal of doing all of that biotech work to recreate passenger pigeons, of course, is to put them back in the wild. And as I've already shown, the idea is that we can restore their dynamic in the forest and bring stability for all those species that are struggling without routine disturbances, and possibly make the long-term work of forest managers a little bit easier with your pals, the passenger pigeons, taking on some of your job. So what does this mean for forest management? I mean, even if I were to get you guys 10 new passenger pigeons to begin a new species in the next 10 years, we need millions of them to actually make impacts in the environment. So it's going to be decades to centuries before we have enough passenger pigeons in the environment, assuming every stakeholder and everyone wants us to do this, before they really take on a role shaping the environment again. So the things I think that matter the most in considering this is looking at the history again. Like, what was the passenger pigeon's role with fire? We know that fire suppression began in the early 1900s, but the First Nations people were using fire as a management tool for thousands of years. Even early European settlers used fire. at a government level, fire suppression began in about the 1910s because the industrial era saw an increase in fire frequency, which, of course, with a growing human population in the East was a threat. So fire suppression started by 1935. The U.S. Forest Service enacted the 10 a.m. rule, the idea that every forest had to be put out by 10 in the morning. And the impacts of that finally became visible in about the 50s when the oak maple shift, the dynamic of the fact that oak that started recolonizing and really taking advantage of that period of fire started to decline and be replaced by shade tolerant maples. So by about the 1960s, managers decided maybe it was time to revisit fire, and that's become increasingly more, I think, not necessarily embraced, but what I hear from Adam and Jen and others is it's becoming more and more used up into the 90s, and now in the last 20 years, people are finally starting to do more fire management combined with tree thinning, shelter wood treatments and things to really try and accomplish their goals. But when I've looked at forestry science, I could only find a few papers that ever mentioned passenger pigeons, this species that was effectively a forest fire and a storm all in one, everywhere all the time, is just absent from forestry research. So what we can extrapolate from our data for roosting and nesting shows that passenger pigeons, once they weren't picky about the tree types, the forest types they were in, they were also nesting and roosting at very different elevations, anywhere from nearly sea level all the way up to maybe 6,000 or more feet in the eastern US. So really just about anywhere you're managing forests, I guarantee in the past, passenger pigeons were making and shaping those forests as well. So Adam was able to share a map of one of their burn units out at Lake James. It's 1,950 acres. He also communicated that the last year, the season, you guys set a record for the Appalachian Consortium at 20,000 acres burned. Well, nearly 20,000 acres is what passenger pigeons were doing every spring when they bred somewhere, or almost every time they roosted. And some roosts were as small as 6 acres, some up to 100 square miles. But that's what that burn unit looks like compared to a 19,200 acre passenger pigeon plot. So these birds, when they were at their prime, were definitely capable of disturbing and creating this process on huge scales. What we know from, or not know, but would need to be accounted for is it's likely that the tree damage they created could open up gaps up to 50%. The guano cleared the understory vegetation almost probably completely in most places where they roosted and nested, especially if it was more than one day. They consumed every food source available within hundreds of miles around a roosting or a nesting site, which put huge competition and displacement on other species for those food. But of course, it was bringing in the species taking advantage of the pigeons. They were huge. Research I haven't shared today that I did on diet is that these birds were majorly seed predators, which was really shaping and putting selection pressure on those masting species. But through regurgitation, and if these birds were to die with a full crop and release seeds, they were possibly a major significant source of seed dispersal. It might have been just a fraction of a percent of birds that were dispersing seeds, but when your population is 3 billion, a fraction of a percent are a lot of seeds possibly traveling hundreds of miles within just a few days. And some calculations of potential guano input per day, literally multiple metric tons of nitrogen and phosphorus, potassium, and other elements are being deposited, basically fertilizers into these units. But we don't know a lot about how the science of that works. So I have a proposal, something I've really wanted to do for a forestry experiment. And I need a bunch of forestry managers and people willing to get on board and make this a reality. I think we could go out to a plot of closed canopy mixed oak, find 2 plots, maybe 1 hectare each in size, of similar elevation, similar biological community, try and get as good of a control and experimental plot as possible, set up camera traps and blinds and use entire classes of students, grad students coming out and take soil samples and characterize the microbiota, the biochemistry, and the fauna and flora, characterize as much about this plot as we can over the course of several seasons, and then come into that experimental plot with a giant group of super enthusiastic volunteers, maybe some university students that want to get involved and get class credit. Maybe a whole university could partner up with this, and those people will go in and break branches and fell trees and scoop up every berry and seed and basically be passenger pigeons. And then South Carolina just so happens to have a pigeon plant, which we could potentially source about maybe 3 18-wheelers full of guano to cover the entire forest floor with about maybe 1 inch of bird poop. And then in the next few years, let's just see what happens. Continue to monitor and check things and check metagenomics of the soil. Do the science to actually get some data behind what a passenger pigeon event might have been like, and definitely what it could be like when these birds are brought back in the present context. So there's a lot I could talk about in additional science, but I just want to dedicate my work and my time to my family. These are my beautiful boys. It's pretty rare to get a picture of toddler twins where they're both looking at the camera and looking good. So this was at breakfast the other day, which they had to eat outside while we were camping. So those are my 2 beautiful boys, Victor and Vince, who are everything to me, and their beautiful mother, who has been completely supportive, whose work actually ended up paying for a lot of my master's degree and my research throughout this, and is still incredibly enthusiastically supportive of me. My parents, who took me to every museum and national park that I wanted to go to as a kid and never missed a single sporting event or science fair. I've had a huge network of people that have supported me the whole way, and I want to recognize that because I realize not everybody has that level of support and privilege, and it's a huge part as to what played into my passions and my history. I want to dedicate some of this work to my grandmother, who is still alive, turning 90 this year, and of course her husband, who was a huge impact on my life, who my grandfather passed away before I got this job, but he would have been just ecstatic to learn that I had finally gotten the chance to do the things I wanted to do since I was 13 years old. I wanted to be a de-extinction biologist when I was 13, and I said I was going to do it. And as long as Revive and Restore can keep bringing in donations to do it, we're going to get there. And with that, I'm happy to take questions. And of course, we'll just point out that anyone who wants to actually support this work and Revive and Restore's much other expansive projects can go to our website and donate, and we can make this happen. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Ben. I feel like it's unfortunate that Zoom webinar doesn't allow us to actually give you a round of applause, but both you and Ian, your presentations were, again, eye-opening for me, especially considering the disturbance work that we do in the world of fire. And I'm going to be thinking about a lot of these things, I think, carrying forward, especially Ian, for some reason, the thought of that recipe for it was Ashila, I think, that's sticking with me in terms of how prevalent the species must have been, how connected they must have been to the human histories and the human populations in this area, that there's a recipe that's been passed down. I'm going to go ahead and kick it off with a few questions that we've gotten in already, but if you have questions, feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom or type them into the chat. We got one early on asking, was it predator satiation part of what made the dense flocking advantageous, and what else drove it?
So predator satiation was definitely an advantage to those giant flocks. I don't believe it drove their evolution. I think it was much more resource dependent. And then, of course, predator satiation became something that kept them common from their predators overcoming them. But yeah, definitely an advantage, but I don't think it drove their evolution. I see a much more complex question is next. Passenger pigeons ate food from 42 different genera of plants. Basically, any seed or berry in a forest, they were eating. They also did eat invertebrates. Band-tailed pigeons today also have basically the exact same diet as passenger pigeons, just with the West Coast varieties of all of their food. So actually, Chief Pokegan noted that during the breeding season, they were eating a lot of worms and insects. They also definitely ate agricultural crops. There's evidence that they ate maize before Europeans arrived from new isotopic data. And until the 1860s, when the seed drill was invented, they were actually quite a big problem for farmers, because farmers would plant their seeds on the ground. That's a great spot for animals to come get them. But once farmers started planting their seeds in the ground, the opportunistic pigeons pass those up. And most birds actually are pests to those types of crops. Not real pests, they come in after harvesting when there's loose grain to pick up.
Thank you. And there's a question in the chat that I think is directed at Ian, asking how do Indigenous values align with de-extinction? Or if you have any thoughts on that.
I do not know. I hope Ian can tell me.
That's certainly a bigger question than one person.
Yeah, I would say. I think there's a lot of value questions regardless. Do either of you care to delve into that, or do we want to leave that for another day? Stick to the comfy objective science.
Well, I will say that, you know, it's I haven't had much luck getting in touch with the First Nations to ask them about what they think about de-extinction, but I want to. Anyone with ties to tribes, I would be happy to present to tribal leaders, come and visit and speak in person. I grew up in Western North Dakota, where we did have passenger pigeons going out that way. I grew up near the Hidatsa, Arikara, Sioux, and you know, got the chance to run track against some of those boys, and they are fast. Those are Olympian speed boys. But we didn't talk much passenger pigeon back then, so I can't say what anybody thought about it back then. I would love the chance to get to talk with more and engage with more First Nations people and know their thoughts and how their knowledge might actually help shape this project to make it successful. Stuart Brand, did they eat American chestnuts? Oh, Stuart's got the inside scoop though from our work. So my work on dietary ecology of the pigeons with morphometrics definitely shows that they were physically capable of eating most of American chestnut crops. But oddly enough, in historic accounts and the science that we have, chestnuts were one of the least consumed foods. Shorger only found one definitive record. I could only find one definitive record of a passenger pigeon ever eating a chestnut. They were definitely much more had a preference towards acorns instead. And it could be that the chestnuts way of protecting their seeds until they're ready to fall was just enough to keep pigeons away. But I don't think passenger pigeons ate chestnuts a great deal. Let's see. Oh, we got lots of, there's so many questions coming in. From Matt Beegler, for initial passenger pigeons, do you have an idea what species would you provide for social behavior? What I'd like to do is I would like to train domestic pigeons who are willing to breed in dense numbers as long as they have their own private little box. I would like to experiment with getting pigeons to breed in a simulated colony in trees. I have personally had rock pigeons breed in baskets before, many people have. I believe we could raise the first generation of passenger pigeons in a tree, in a simulated colony using rock pigeons, and use speakers, sound systems to simulate the noise of a much larger colony and make it so that our first generation of passenger pigeons have the social cues and environment that foster their behavior. In avian conservation, a lot of pigeons are raised by other species in zoos and among private aviculturists, and it doesn't seem to affect their behavior. They adjust to their own species quite well. There's definitely a significant genetic component to avian behavior. In pigeons in particular, which are one of the more basal groups of birds. But I do believe those social cues matter. I think we can do that with rock pigeons. How does your work aid recovery of other colonial nesters, such as Nicobar pigeons? I am not sure. That is an interesting question. Nicobar pigeons are such a different species, and they're a tropical wood pigeon, so I'm not very sure. Let's see.
And if we can, I'd like to push down to this one question about,
Yeah, go ahead.
besides fire, because I also have this question, and we've had a lot of discussions recently in the fire world about the role of beavers and fire, and especially when you start thinking about cane breaks and the role of beavers as ecosystem engineers, because they would create these floodplains which would allow the cane breaks, in case anyone's not familiar with that process. And his question is, besides fire and passenger pigeons, there were other major sources of large-scale disturbances, such as bison and beavers. Has anyone addressed the possible interactions of these disturbances?
No, not that I know of. Ian, do you know of any of that?
No, I don't.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, there were, for many thousands of years, there were even mastodon, of course, in the eastern forests. There were super megafauna and other megafauna roaming about the forests with these giant flocks of pigeons. That is a dynamic that would be really interesting to understand more, but I've not seen any research on it, and I'm not even really sure where to start. We needed more better science on passenger pigeons, but I think even though a lot of this science is not yet published, it gives us a much more better idea of the natural history of the passenger pigeon, and gives us some data, particularly that mapping data, in a way that we could begin, with the right clever minds out there that know more about bison and elk and other things in the eastern US, that we could start possibly trying to do some simulations on what that entire ecological community was doing, because all of those megafauna were huge nutrient transporters and engineers.
Yeah, and I mean, I know especially in the Appalachians, most bison, elk, and beaver were gone, I think, about by 1800, and bison and elk quickly followed them by 1830s, I think. And so honestly, when you first started talking about the numbers for passenger pigeons, my thought was, how did they hang on so long, compared to these other, big generalist herbivore species?
And returning to bison, they weren't common east of the Mississippi River from the end of the Pleistocene up until 1600 or so.
Mm-hmm.
So there would have certainly been times for interaction, but not most of the Holocene so much, unless it was on their western range.
Well, and all of those species work to support or gain things from those cane breaks, which were just amazing resources for humans and the animals that were living there, and they are not really around anymore. Any other questions popping out?
Let's see. A lot of these are de-extinction related. I'll try and hit a few of these with one answer. When passenger pigeons are revived, will they be released on public and tribal lands? Well, that would, of course, be my preference. I would like it if private, public, tribal lands, if everybody was willing to get on board with releasing passenger pigeons. And the truth is, since they're nomadic, the moment you release them, and for a true release, they're going to go anywhere they want. So it doesn't really matter so much where you release them as to possibly where and when, and if they have the ability to roam, which they should. It's not like fences can keep in passenger pigeons. So yeah, so having everybody on board, I think, early, understanding why disturbances are important, why fire and other disturbances are important, why so many other species depend on those, and the fact that, something that I think forestry managers already know is, in the eastern United States, even though we have more forest, we continue to lose diversity. The species that Henry Thoreau and other people waxed poetically about are disappearing in the eastern United States, and this has been a trend that people have been recognizing for decades. And so disturbance ecology is key to helping us retain the species we have. We face a choice. We can either let species die out and have a closed canopy forest that's a very different environment than has really ever been there, or we do serious management to conserve the species that we care about, and stop doing it, in a box all the time. I don't think nature has to be something that fits our comfort zone. One question I don't think I've seen here, but I often get a lot is, don't you think passenger pigeons might be, a nuisance or a pest? And I would say, I'm from North Dakota. I went to school in Montana. And in northwestern Montana are people that truly love nature. They live and eke out a living in an area that has sub-zero winter temperatures with high snowfall, scorching summers, and they live alongside mountain lions, grizzly bears, black bears, deer, elk, moose, and wolves. And they adapt to it because that's what you do if you love nature. People for years have managed to shape the land and yet still live in harmony with other species. Yet the modern Anglican American population, particularly urbanized, want to fit nature into a little box that fits and suits their life. And to me, that's a level of narcissism and arrogance that, speaking candidly without any nuance anymore, says, if I want nature to be comfortable for me, I'm more important than the other trillions of organisms on this planet that have billions of years of evolutionary history. And it stands in the face, I think, of what many cultures even embrace on this planet. So I would hope that no matter what, if it takes a few decades or centuries to get large flocks back, that in that time people can adapt to whatever type of mitigation strategy they need to live alongside them. And that for private landowners, even though this is going to create disturbances that are horrible on private lands that look horrible in a few weeks, it's going to create huge benefits long term. So goodness, we've got so many questions about so many different things. And I'm going to actually just say, first off, I am not a forestry scientist, so I cannot answer a lot of these, which is why I'm actually, one of the big things I want out of this talk is to engage with more forestry scientists, more stakeholders that could have huge impacts on this project. Because I feel like this is something that could, be in your wheelhouse. And this is a chance for this project to finally start engaging with the stakeholders who would be the end users of the type of things we're trying to do. So I can't answer a lot of those questions because we need new science.
And Ben, actually, I also just wanted to throw out there that we are about 3 minutes to closing time. So we might have time for one more quick question that I'd like to ask you both for your sort of final thoughts. And if you're willing, we could try and set up a time where you can answer some more of these questions. Maybe do a record or add it to the recording as an addendum, something like that. But we can work on that offline because there are a lot of really great questions in here. So I'll let you choose your last one.
Well, here is a question to Ian, right from Matt Beegler. I don't. Can you see that question, Ian or Jen?
Yeah. Says you had mentioned the presence of the Carolina parakeet in archaeological sites, which is another notable extinct North American bird and had been the only North American parrot. I'd be very curious to learn about any additional information on the relationship between this species and the Choctaw or other First Nations people.
The Choctaw name for it is T. I assume that's an onomatopoeia that mimics the call, probably. I know that they were important for their plumage. There are these feather capes that were made in the American Southeast. They're just beautiful. They're similar to the robes worn by Hawaiian leaders traditionally, if you've seen those. Those are also, made in the Eastern United States, and colorful plumage, like on that bird, the green, yellow, that would certainly play a role as a design element. But in terms of broader cultural connections, I don't know a whole lot.
Thank you. So I also wanted to thank you, especially for sharing the language and the history behind that, because it's also so closely tied to the value and the interactions between humans and our neighbor species, I suppose. And really quick, I just saw a question from Stuart about reviving canebrakes. There is there's firework being done to revive canebrakes through especially the Southern Apps. And I know some of our partners in the Eastern Band of the Cherokee have been working towards that too for cultural resources.
There's also a whole broad partnership in the Southeast among tribes and major land institutions, including federal agencies, for doing large river cane restoration. There's a meeting coming up in October about that. Yeah,
there's a pretty big, pretty widespread recognition that these were important ecosystems and that they need to be revived for multiple reasons. Do either of you have anything you'd like to leave us with before we close out?
I'll leave with two things. One, I'll just quick answer David Burney's question. Hi, Bernie. Thank you, David. Thank you for Dr. Burney. Thank you for attending. I haven't seen you in a couple of years. He says, if we're successful with gene editing passenger pigeons, could this be applied to dodos, flightless birds of Hawaii, the moas of New Zealand? And is anybody focusing on these? Well, the dodo bird genome, a dodo bird genome has been sequenced. There has been one moa genome sequenced, a great auk genome sequenced, Carolina parakeet. I mean, in truth, if we can fundraise the money we need to innovate the primordial germ cell culture and transmission technology for a variety of bird species, really anything that we can get a genome from that has a living relative is in the wheelhouse of what we could do. That is something that is a major thing we're trying to do right now. But just to put it out there, you know, that some of the funds that are needed for this, if Revive and Restore were to receive, you know, $25 million from maybe some rich millionaire or $10 from 2.5 million people, you know, we could actually have the money we need to build the facilities, hire more full-time staff, and get the scientists on board to innovate this technology and make this happen in a relatively quick time. These innovations and the things we're talking about doing, they don't need tons of new brand new science and genius. They actually really just need money, because there are brilliant people already making these innovations and breakthroughs, but these are happening in medicine and agriculture and other fields and not being applied to this. And so for people that want to endorse and get behind this and do more science, we've been working mostly collaboratively on our de-extinction projects. Most of our money comes in for our genetic rescue efforts. And I'm always happy to talk passenger pigeons and what more science we can do. Sam Mady has been working as a volunteer. Holland Shaw attended the talk. He worked as one of our volunteers. And we are not a project funded at the moment that can pay staff to do a lot of science on this. But if some of this research could fit into things other people are doing, then let's talk about how we could maybe get some grants, some fundraising, and do some amazing forestry and science and stakeholder engagement and spread the word. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Ian, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Sure. Two things for me as well. One is that, you know, I presented a Choctaw connection with this now extinct species. You know, that's a particular indigenous connection with a particular part of the globe, going back hundreds of generations. But everybody descends from indigenous people. It doesn't matter if you're Native American, European, or African, wherever you come from, you have ancestors that have that same type of relationship with the local landscape going back a very long time. This is part of a broader relationship. Obviously, I'm preaching to the choir here, but if you look back at the statements that were made by colonial society about the passenger pigeon during its last years, you know, many times the idea was that the passenger pigeons were living in another area, that they changed their migration, that there were just too many to die, or that, you know, maybe they were already gone to a point where they couldn't be saved. It didn't matter. It's extremely similar to the arguments that we hear today about climate change and reasons not to mitigate against it, ecological destruction, disruption, all of this. So as descendants of indigenous people, we're tied in with the global planet in the same way that the Choctaw ancestors were with the passenger pigeon. And clearly we have choices to make now on whether we want a livable future or not, based on sustainable interactions with the ecosystems around us. So I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to talk, and also Ben for the work that you're doing to try to make things more sustainable and livable in the Eastern US. And again, appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you. Beautifully put. I think there is a science delivery person as my main function. There is a fundamental misunderstanding in a lot of areas about the impacts we can have for good and bad on our environment. I agree. Just thank you both so much, and thank you for this information. And for all of our attendees or anyone that didn't get a chance to join, there will be a recording of this presentation. It'll take us a little bit to process, and then feel free to share it far and wide. You can also, I put our website, the CAFM's website, in the chat, www.appalachianfire.org, or you can check our Facebook or Twitter, facebook.com/CAFMS, CAFMS. Thank you all again, and we'll see you next time.